They were headed for a bad time in France because France used them for years to work cleaning up the mines and just to make life miserable for them. This is described in that book by James Bach called Other Losses. Contrary to what you may have heard, there are no cattle cars in Europe. They don't raise cattle to be shipped to some stockyard somewhere. They have coal cars, like on the track next to us, and box cars that we were going to be in. I don't think there's probably, most people haven't given a lot of thought of what happened to the German army after the war. They didn't just all of a sudden appear back into Germany. These prisoners that we just saw on the opposite track were headed into France. They could have just as well, by this time, made prison camps in Germany itself to keep them. And what happened to all these men? They were kept as slaves in France for years, some of them. For instance, the army captured Stalingrad, over 200,000. Only 5,000 came back eventually. After the war, they were still in France. They kept a lot of them doing repair work. I saw some on the way back from Paris at one time. They had the German soldiers out demining where the fighting had been. Very few Americans saw what I have seen on one of these trips. When I'd drive an officer to Le Havre from Germany, we went on a certain route where the Army supplied fuel for our vehicles. One time, coming back, I decided I'd take a different route coming back from Germany. So out of Paris, I took some highway that headed into Germany, would have headed into Germany, south of where Melsungen was. So, but when I got to the border between Germany and France, there was a check station there, and even though I was in uniform and in the Jeep, the French people there manning this checkpoint wanted to see my passport. Well, I didn't have any passport, and here I am stuck out away from Paris and without gas if I had to make a long trip. And so, but before that, coming back through France, out in these fields, I'd see the German soldiers out looking for mines. So this was, well, in the summer or maybe fall of 45. So but finally I just kind of talked my way through. They let me go without a passport, so I just kind of blustered my way through and came on back to our post, that was a kind of a real dumb thing for me to do, but it worked. But I saw things on that trip that no other American saw, because Americans couldn't travel that way because you had no gasoline. And there was a book written by James Bach. It was titled Other Losses. Showed that even the horrible treatment afterwards by the French, even the Americans, although this camp I showed you, no one has told me how come in this Other Losses book how so many died, but these obviously were not dead. They were not treated well because at Darmstadt, they had a detachment come to the caserne there, and they spent a lot of time just policing up the area. But and the sergeant treated them. They had one guy who had picked up a cigarette butt, and the sergeant in charge saw him, put it in his pocket, and made him run, fall to the ground, get up, run, fall to the ground, like they do in training. And of course, these guys were probably not fed that much, so he was exhausted in just a few moments. So these guys were not treated well, and there was a huge shortage of men in Germany for, I would imagine, a long time after the war. Being tough on Germans was the deliberate policy of the army, because when they went into Germany, soldiers were informed that, they'd take the wraps off. And I've always wondered if that wasn't one of the reasons why looting of Germans immediately after the war was permitted without any particular objection. You would think from the bad press that the Nazis got about World War II that wherever the German army went, there would be murder and looting and all kinds of bad reports. But the Germans were such disciplined that there was no looting done by the German personnel, the soldiers. Might have been done by Göring and the bigwigs, but where the German army went, none of that went on. In fact, in France, when Germany conquered France, they would not billet a German soldier in a house where there was a unwed female. So, and when the United States landed at Normandy, within 6 months, there were 500 Americans condemned to death for murder and rape. See Churchill's War by David Irving for the details. So, and of course, I'm sitting next to a table where a German war bride is, and she was in Berlin when the Russians conquered Berlin, and there was just raping and murder. In fact, she herself was raped by the Russians. I don't know how many times. I haven't talked to her about how many times, but it was absolutely horrible. I'll go into that in more depth in the next chapter. The house that we were in showed no evidence of looting by Germans by bringing things home in the form of souvenirs. The only thing that I found foreign there was one picture of a German vehicle in Russia, apparently bogged down in the mud. They were trying to get out of the mud. But the German army was too disciplined to permit them to do the undisciplined actions that other armies did. Of course, it was deliberate policy by the Russians to let them or their soldiers rape and murder in return for some of the atrocities that perhaps the army did to them, but that wasn't the individual Russian soldier. That was the policy of the officers and the politicians such as Göring and Hitler. One thing that made the Germans so effective was the discipline. I can't think of one thing right now, but a soldier, if he was found more than a mile behind the line without his rifle, he was shot. They didn't send him to jail, they shot him. On the other hand, the respect between the soldier and the officer was very good because they knew that the officer was working under the same restrictions. Hitler would just soon shoot an officer as a ordinary soldier, so at least they had some respect in that order. You didn't find the officers lording it over like they do in the American army, which resulted in fragging and all that stuff that happened in Vietnam. And eventually, at night, the next night, we arrived in Verviers, Belgium. Going from France into Belgium, we had to change trains, of course, to boxcars. The old 40 and 8 fame of World War I fame. 40 men or 8 horses. Now the roads were very bad in Belgium because of all the fighting there, obviously, plus the attempt by the air forces of U.S. Air Force to destroy the roads before the Germans were run out. They were really bad. Train probably couldn't go over 20 miles an hour, but the last car in the train jumped the tracks for a while, and it got bouncing along there. I don't know how those guys inside managed, but it must have been quite a ride until they stopped and put it back on the track. Verviers was in the area of Saint-Vith and Bastogne, Belgium, where such heavy fighting went on during the Battle of the Bulge. So there was a lot of war damage in that area. There was a division, at least, of Belgians who fought for Germany in this war. And in fact, Belgium is, in a way, like Switzerland. They have several nationalities, and the French and the other Dutch-speaking types don't like each other very much. The Belgians who fought for Germany were in the Waffen-SS. In the 1930s, Stalin engineered a famine in the Ukraine which starved 8 million Ukrainians. This famine is at the bottom of what's going on in the Ukraine now, because it was, of course, the Russians, communists, that helped or enforced what was going on that created this famine in the Ukraine. So in World War II, when Germany invaded the Ukraine, he had a lot of willing helpers to help him. Therefore, a million Ukrainians fought for Germany in the war. After the war, of course, these million Ukrainians were sent back to Russia, and they were never heard of again. So that is at the bottom of this hate and problem that's going on in Ukraine today. Look up Operation Keel Haul. The 3rd Infantry helped round up these Ukrainians to send them back. They did not want to go because they knew they were going to die there in Russia. They brought us into Verviers after dark. We could hear the guns in the distance, and we immediately unloaded and were marched out of town. Marched off and marched out of town a ways and to what was an old abandoned factory, which we were using as temporary quarters until we shipped up into France. So it was some guy out and back wanted to go out to the latrine, and there was a empty hole there, and he fell in it and hurt himself, I guess. But that was bad because it was so dark you didn't see it.